First, I want to give you a few words of encouragement, just like I would do if we were meeting in person. The slide is optional. It's just going to be one of my pep talks, so if you prefer to skip it, that's okay. I'll never know. I just want to let you know that you are not at your most productive right now, and that's okay. None of us are doing the best we've ever done right now because we're dealing with a lot of very difficult and unprecedented things that we don't know how to deal with. We've made an unexpected transition to online learning. We're learning in a different environment. We don't have the same barriers around our time that we're used to having, and this is a unique challenge. However, I believe that you are all, each and every one of you, doing your very best. I'm doing my best under the circumstances, so I assume that each of you are too. You can't expect to be the most productive you've ever been right now, but I believe in you, and I believe that you are trying your very hardest. I also want you to remember that we're all in this together. Just like you're not at your very best right now, neither is anyone else. We are all trying, and we all need to be kind and patient to one another and to ourselves. I want you to know that we are all going to get through this together. We're going to support each other, help each other, discuss with each other, encourage each other, and we are going to come out of this. We're going to return to normal eventually. We may have to discover a new normal, but we're going to adjust and adapt just like we're doing right now, and it is going to be okay. If I could give you a little advice during this difficult time, it would be to be kind to yourself. You are probably struggling and having some difficulty just like the rest of us. But remember to be patient, to be generous, to forgive yourself for foibles, and to love yourself through this difficult time. I'd also like you to remember what's really important. Remember that even if you're struggling in school right now, you are a whole person. You are not your academic performance. You are not your grades. You are not how you do on a single assignment. You are an entire person. You are a beloved family member and precious friend who deserves to be loved and cared about regardless of how you're doing in school right at this minute. Remember to care about yourself, to care about your family, to care about your neighbors and your loved ones. And remember that in the grand scheme of things, however you're doing in this course is going to not really matter. No one who loves you is going to love you any less just because of how you do in this course. That said, I want you to remember that I care about you and that I want you to do the best you want to do. So I encourage you to reach out to me and let me know if there's anything I can do to help you with this class or with anything else related to academics. I'm still here for you even though I'm distant, and you are still very important to me just as if I were seeing your faces in person twice a week. This has been my words of encouragement to you. I hope it's been encouraging and edifying, and if you skipped it, feel free to come back and listen to it another time. Now, with my pep talk out of the way, we're going to discuss race and racism. This week's topic is race and ethnicity. It's going to be a little bit dense. I encourage you to break it up and maybe to do the first half of the lecture on Monday and the second half on Wednesday, just as we would do if we were meeting in person. In order to understand race and racism, we need to understand that race is a social construct. What I mean by that is that racial categories are created by human beings. They're not naturally occurring. They change over time and place. So if something is naturally occurring, we expect that it remains fairly stable across time and place. An example of something naturally occurring is human teeth. We can recognize human teeth, human dentition, in the remains of prehistoric humans, in humans from all over the world, in humans from antiquity. Teeth don't change very much because they're naturally occurring. Racial categories, on the other hand, and even the very concept of race, is a very modern idea that came out of a specific historical context, specifically 18th century Europe. In Europe in the 1700s, a few things were going on. Certain nations in Europe, especially Spain, England, and the Netherlands, were going through a period of what they termed exploration, and can be understood as colonialism. During this time period, nations of Western Europe were traveling to, documenting and colonizing different parts of the world, including the African continent, South America, Asia, what we think of now as the global South. Before this period, racial categories didn't really exist. We understood that people from different parts of the world looked different, but we didn't really have an idea that people could be categorized based on how they looked. The idea of racial categories, as opposed to just differences in the way people look, can be understood as part of the rise of modernity. The rise of modernity is characterized by a rise in Enlightenment thinking in Europe. That is, a growing fascination with the idea of science, the scientific method, the idea that the world and the universe is ordered, and that things are arranged more or less hierarchically. This involves an emphasis on classification. So, during this rise of modernity in the 18th century in Europe, we saw an emphasis on classification of all types of things, including plants. So we had botanical taxonomies, animals, we had zoological taxonomies, and people. We created racial taxonomies to describe different classifications of people to fit with this paradigm of Enlightenment thinking. Enlightenment thinking was also characterized by an emphasis on hierarchy and improvement, specifically a belief that things improved with time and that some things were inherently better than others. So, if you think about how animals are classified, they're classified by kingdom, the animal kingdom, and then by lesser categories. Some animals were seen as more intelligent than others, more noble than others. In the same way, cultures were classified based on how advanced they were perceived to be. And there was this idea that if humans varied, then inherently some variations were better or more important than others. So we see this in the way racial taxonomies emerged during this time. We're going to look at some examples next. This image shows us an early example of how racial categories emerged out of colonialism. So this is an example of a casta painting. Casta paintings were a popular style of artwork in 17th century or in 18th century Latin America, and they are literally paintings that just depict the hierarchy of races based on the parentage of the child. So, and it's deliberately hierarchical. I've edited this painting to only show the first 8 panels. In fact, there are 16. So I've cut it in half. But you can Google casta paintings and find more examples. So we see that in the top left, representing the highest category, we have the combination of a Spanish man and an Indian woman, resulting in a race called mestizo, or mixed. In the second panel from the right, we see the combination of a Spanish, or of a mestizo man with a Spanish woman, representing a castizo, or resulting in a castizo person. If then this castizo person marries a Spanish woman, it results in a Spanish person. So we can see that basically the Indian blood can be diluted out to the point that the child is again considered Spanish. Then, if this Spanish person marries a Mora or an African person, the result is a mulatto. Mulatto comes from the same root as mule, and literally means like half. If a mulatto person marries a Spanish person, we get a Morisco. And if a Morisco person marries a Spanish person, we get a Chino. Chino means, in this case, curly. It can also literally mean Chinese, but in Mexican Spanish, Chino means curly. If you mix a Chino with an Indian person, you get a Salta Atlas. And if you mix a Salta Atlas with a mulatto person, you get a Lobo. Lobo means wolf. So you see that based on colonialism and colonial culture, the more Spanish or white you were, the higher you were in the hierarchy. Mixing with Indian was considered preferable to mixing with black, and there were different categories in the hierarchy for black people who were mixed with Indian people, etc. So although these don't relate to the racial categories as we understand them in contemporary United States, they do show how racial categories emerged out of colonialization and this Enlightenment fascination with taxonomy. Moving into the 19th century and shifting our focus from Spain to England, we see an etching from the book Principal Varieties of Mankind, published by James Reynolds in 1850 in London. We see that James Reynolds has categorized human beings into 6 categories: Asiatics, Australians, Europeans, Polynesians, Africans, and Americans. And we see that this grouping centers around Europeans. Europeans are literally in the middle of the image. Everyone else is surrounding Europeans. And if you consider the timeline, this is 1850, what we're looking at here is basically a map of the continents and parts of the world that that England was currently colonizing, where the Spanish categorized combinations of African people, Indian people, and Spanish people. The map of, the English map categorizes people based on where England was colonizing at the time. So we have Australians as their own race. We have Polynesians as their own race. American Indians, Africans, and Asiatics are lumped together, even though there's significant diversity in the appearance of Africans, American Indians, and Asiatics, even in this drawing. By the end of the 19th century, categories had already changed from 1850. So in the left-hand panel on this slide, you see 5 human categories instead of 6. Australians have disappeared, and Polynesians have been replaced with Malayans in the lower right-hand corner. In the upper left-hand corner, we still have American Indians. In the upper right-hand corner, we see what were termed Mongolians. In the lower left-hand corner, we see what were termed Ethiopians. In the lower right-hand corner is Malayans, which would include Pacific Islanders and indigenous Australians. And then, of course, in the center, we have Europeans. On the right-hand half of this slide, we see essentially the same racial categorizations with some variation within categories from the 1950s. This is actually from a biology textbook in 1952. And we see the 3 main types of humans that people agreed existed until about the 1970s, which were Caucasian, with variation within Caucasian. Notice that Caucasian includes Hindu, or people of the Indian subcontinent. Mongolian includes American Indians now, including Asiatic people and Malay people. And Ethiopian now includes African, Pygmy, and Oceanic people, which would include Native Australians and other Pacific Islanders, including the residents of Papua New Guinea, for example. What all these taxonomies of human beings have in common is that they're all made up, they're all completely invented by human societies, they all emerged from a specific moment in history. So we can see how Spanish reckonings of race in the 1700s differ from English reckonings of race in the 1850s versus American reckonings of race in the 1950s. They all came from specific moments in history, and they all reflect hierarchy. All categories of race are built around systems of social power. So we see that the Spanish system and the English system were largely based on colonialism, with the later American system building on this history of colonialism without necessarily explicitly acknowledging it. Hierarchy exists within all racial systems. When we categorize things, we almost always view them hierarchically, especially when the categories we create for people or things come from systems of political power. It's also worth noting that these categories of race for human beings were created by Europeans. They were created by the colonizer. They were created by the people who were, quote unquote, discovering these different groups of people. And they were defining them in their own terms and grouping them according to their purposes. So this reveals another truth about race, which is the dominant category has the power to define other racial categories. For another really interesting illustration of how racial categories change over time within a society, I invite you to follow this link and go to the pewresearch.org interactive website, What the Census Calls Us. What it does is look at the race question in the United States Census from 1790, the first year the census was taken, to the new 2020 census. And it looks at how racial categorizations have changed in the United States. So I want to introduce you to a paradox, which is that race is both imaginary and real. I've just spent the past few slides arguing that race is completely made up, and in fact, it is. There's no genetic basis for race. That is, blood tests or genetic testing can tell you where you're from or where your ancestors came from, but they can't tell you what racial category you fall into because racial categories are variable. They change from time to time and place to place, and they're made up. So you'll never take a DNA test that tells you that you're Caucasian. It might tell you that your ancestors likely came from Denmark, but it's not going to tell you that you're white. It's going to tell you what proportion of your blood comes from where. So racial categories are created around systems of power. We've discussed how contemporary racial categories emerged from systems of colonialism. However, social structures are then built around these symbolic categories. We create categories to reflect systems of power, and then we build social structures on the basis of these categories. For example, the Georgia State Capitol building, where I once interned, has two sets of bathrooms on every floor. They've now been turned into men's restrooms and women's restrooms, but they were originally white bathrooms and black bathrooms because we structured our society around the idea that black and white people were inherently different. We built social structures, including the structure of chattel slavery, around our conceptions of race. Then human interaction is mediated through these structures. So we create social structures around race. We create conceptions of what it means to be a person of color or a white person in the United States, and then we interact with each other based on these structures. So this brings us to our old friend, the Thomas theorem, which tells us that situations defined as real are real in their consequences. What this means for race is that even though we completely made up racial categories based on systems of power, we then built social structures around those categories and interact based on those structures. So what this means is that the made up concept of race has very real consequences for people in the United States today, because we treat race as a real thing, even though it's socially constructed. Now I want to talk about 3 ways in which human beings interact around the concept of race. The 3 concepts we're going to talk about, prejudice, discrimination, and racism, are often wrongly treated as synonyms. But in fact, they mean quite different things, and we're going to talk about them now. Prejudice is the first concept I want us to talk about. Prejudices are individual thoughts and attitudes about people based on race. Prejudices may or may not be expressed. I can privately think something about a racialized group without ever saying or acting upon it. Another fact about prejudices is that prejudices may be held by anyone about any group. So, for example, a black person may believe that all white people are bad dancers. This is a prejudice. It doesn't matter who holds it about whom. It's still an attitude or thought held about a person based on their race. Another fact about prejudices is that they may appear positive, but generalizations are still harmful. For example, a white person may believe that all Asian people are good at math. Now, on its face, this appears to be a positive stereotype, but if you're an Asian person and you struggle with mathematics, you may not like being stereotyped as someone who's good at math. It may disadvantage you in an academic setting. And even if you are an Asian person who happens to be fair to good at math, you may not like to have that attributed to your race, as opposed to, say, your hard work in math class. Similarly, an Asian person may believe that black people are naturally good athletes. If you are a black person who happens to be athletic, it may be very insulting for you to be told that your athleticism is because of your race and not because of your carefully developed skill at a sport. Similarly, it can be harmful for black people overall to be pigeonholed as naturally athletic, because then they may not be offered other opportunities outside of sport. A similar but distinct idea to prejudice is discrimination. Discrimination is treating a person or persons unfairly, in this case based on race. So discrimination is putting an unfair belief or attitude about race into practice. Unlike prejudices, which can be held in the privacy of your own brain, discrimination is actually treating someone unfairly. It's important to note that anyone can perpetrate discrimination. And anyone may be the target of discrimination. For example, if a white person is refused service in a black owned establishment, that's an example of discrimination. It doesn't matter that the person practicing discrimination is black and the person being discriminated against is white. It's still unfair treatment based on race. It's also possible to discriminate without holding any particular prejudices. So, discrimination is generally motivated by a prejudice, but it doesn't have to be. For example, I could promote a white person at work over a more qualified Latina or Latino person just because I feel more comfortable around white people. I don't have to believe any particular negative thing about Latino people. I can just have a preference based on race for white people, not based on any particular prejudice. This is still an example of discrimination. Discrimination and racism are most often used interchangeably in our society. When we talk about racism, we most often mean discrimination. Racism has a specific meaning for sociologists. It's prejudice and or discrimination which reinforces racial hierarchy. So, racism is really any behavior that tends to reinforce existing racial hierarchies or racial power structures. So, racism, like discrimination and prejudice, can be perpetrated by anyone. Anyone can do a racist thing, but what's important to realize about racism is that the less powerful group is always targeted. So, in my example of a white person being refused service in an all black establishment, this is absolutely discrimination, and it's absolutely a problem. But it isn't racism because it doesn't reinforce racial hierarchy. Here's what I mean. If I were to be refused service in a restaurant that was all black because I were a white person, what would I do about it? Well, I would leave that restaurant and go to any number of other restaurants where that wouldn't happen to me. There's no system of racial hierarchy that consistently promotes black people over white people, so it would be very difficult for me to argue that I was ever a target of racism, because any discrimination or prejudice I may face doesn't reinforce an existing racial hierarchy. Another way of thinking about this is the historical context in which discrimination takes place. There's no history in the United States of systematic segregation and disenfranchisement against white people. So, for example, there's no history of white people not being allowed to eat in restaurant dining rooms. So to return to my example of a white person not being served in an all-black establishment, that doesn't call any particular painful history to mind for me. If I were not served in an all-black establishment, I wouldn't think about the time that my grandmother had to sit in at a lunch counter to protest exactly this kind of discrimination. Instead, I would just think it was a very odd and rare occurrence and move on with my life. Whereas, if a black person faced a similar act of discrimination, it would call to mind for them a history of Jim Crow segregation and possibly even worse forms of racism that existed in the past. It plays into systematic racial hierarchies that already exist. So this is really where discrimination and racism differ. Discrimination can target anybody, but the less powerful group is the target of racism since it specifically reinforces racial hierarchy. Now that we've talked about what racism is, we're going to talk about some different types of racism that exist in our society. Old-fashioned racism is what we're generally talking about when we think about racism in our society. Old-fashioned racism is pretty easy to identify. It's characterized by explicit individual beliefs about racial hierarchy. For example, white supremacist organizations that explicitly believe that white people are better than non white people. It's also characterized by deliberate interpersonal racism. An example would be someone deliberately choosing not to hire people based on race or ethnicity. So, if I have a small business and I have an unofficial policy that if a person of color applies, I lose their application, I'm deliberately practicing racial discrimination or interpersonal racism. Um, Old fashioned racism is often, though not always, explicitly reflected in laws and norms. So, a historical example would be Jim Crow laws, but we can see this in contemporary United States. For example, there's a news story that crops up every year about a high school in Mississippi which holds segregated proms. Officially, the school doesn't sponsor a prom, um, but the White Parents Association um, sponsors an all white prom, and an association of black parents hosts an all black prom. The school doesn't explicitly hold a prom or doesn't officially hold a prom, specifically so they don't have to allow students of different races to attend the same prom. Structural or institutional racism may be much harder to identify. It's racism which is built into social and institutional structures, which then goes on to reinforce systems of racial hierarchy. An example of this is that for decades, many companies and the United States military had dress codes which prohibited most natural black hairstyles. What this meant was, if you were a black person and you wanted to work for these companies or branches of the military, you had to style your hair in a way that wasn't necessarily natural. You had to either shave your head, chemically process your hair, or otherwise fit your hair into traditionally white hairstyles. This extra effort disadvantaged black employees, but beyond that, it sent the message that people who look like you aren't really wanted here. A note about about structural and institutional racism is that it does not require individuals to hold racist attitudes. Since racism is built into the structure of social institutions, it's not required for individual people to hold racist attitudes, although many still do. So, for example, a military officer could write up or discipline a recruit for having an unapproved hairstyle because they had natural black hair. They don't have to hate black people, they're just enforcing a rule which disadvantages black people. Another example of this is that many colleges offer legacy scholarships. Legacy scholarships are scholarships given to students whose parents or older siblings or grandparents attended the same institution. Since most colleges in the United States are historically white and didn't even admit black students often until the 70s, or graduate black students sometimes until the 80s or even 90s, legacy scholarships overwhelmingly benefit white students. This image is from a New York Times article published in 2017, and it shows that the United States Army had recently revised its dress code to allow black women to wear small braids and dreadlock twists as part of their uniform, where before these hairstyles had been prohibited. The Marine Corps had approved lock and twist hairstyles in 2015, so they're ahead of the curve then. And this is a chart from 2014 on Harvard University's admission of students with legacy scholarships. So we see that 27.28% of white students received legacy scholarships, compared with 5.82% of black students, 9.51% of Hispanic students, and 11.5% of Asian students. Colorblind racism is a little harder to explain. Colorblind racism is when someone, either a person or an institution, refuses to acknowledge the effects of historical and contemporary racism in a way that reinforces racial hierarchies. An example of this might be making a race-neutral policy, which has racist consequences. So, in a society characterized by racism and built on a racist history, if we simply decide to ignore race going forward, we could end up perpetuating inequality. Here's an example. Studies have shown that when predominantly and historically white colleges and universities use race-blind admissions policies, that is, they don't know what an applicant's race is when they're making admissions decisions, they consistently underadmit students of color. Now, part of this may be due to school districts that are predominantly African American or Latino having worse reputations or worse test outcomes, but even controlling for that, we find that when race-blind admissions policies are used, nominators and reviewers select mostly white students. This could be because the admitters, the people making admissions decisions, just have an idea of what kind of student fits in at the school, what kind of student is quote-unquote a good fit. If the only students who have been admitted in the past are mostly white, then people making admissions decisions are likely to stereotype white students as being a good fit and ignore students of color. This is an example of race-blind policies that can tend to reinforce racial hierarchy, because even though the intention is to admit students equally regardless of race, based only on qualifications, what ends up happening is that inequality is perpetuated. What seems to work much better is a deliberate diversity initiative, meaning that schools look at the race of applicants and deliberately seek to admit at least some number of students of color who are qualified to go to the school. Another example of colorblind racism is interpersonal behavior which ignores the racialized experiences of people of color. So when we think of being colorblind, we think of it as a good thing. We would think it would be best to just not attend to race at all, to just imagine everyone is exactly the same. The problem with that is that, as we discussed with the Thomas theorem, racism has real consequences in the real lives of real people. So when we choose to ignore race, for example, by claiming that I don't see race, we can end up ignoring and minimizing experiences of racism that our friends have. So when someone tells you that they were discriminated against based on race, or that they were treated unfairly based on race, and we say, oh, look, race isn't important to me, I don't even see race, what we're doing is basically brushing that experience of racism under the rug and saying, I don't want to deal with that, which is something that, perpetuates racist systems and racist behavior, because we're refusing to grapple with the fact that racism exists in our society. Instead of being colorblind, it's better to address issues of racism and look for solutions. Ethnicity and race are different but related categories. We often use race and ethnicity interchangeably in our day-to-day conversations, but for sociologists, race and ethnicity mean specific things. We're going to talk about ethnicity now. Similar to race, ethnicity is a system of social categories. But unlike race, these categories are defined by cultural factors such as language, religion, tradition, history, and nationality, instead of by how people look. So, like race, ethnicity is a social construction. That means what we consider ethnic groups are not objectively real. People have ties to their culture, but that may mean different things. For example, people may feel very bounded to their religion, but not to their language, or to their food traditions and history, but not to a particular nationality. The way we group people into ethnicities is often determined by powerful groups. So, the more powerful or dominant cultural group tends to decide what constitutes an ethnic group. For example, in the United States, we often refer to Latin Americans or Latinos or Latino culture, when in fact, Latin America has many different cultures. It makes very little sense to say that an Argentinian and a Guatemalan person have the same Latino culture when in fact they come from two completely different parts of the continent, have different foods, different music traditions, different histories, different nationalities, and different cultures. But because they speak Spanish and tend to be Catholic and come from Latin America, in the United States, we've decided that that constitutes an ethnic group. The same thing can be said about Jewish people and Jewish culture. In the United States, when we talk about Jewish people and Jewish culture, we tend to have in mind Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe, who are predominantly what we would call white, speak Yiddish, and have Eastern European cultural habits. When in fact, Jewish people exist across the world in many cultures and have multiple ethnic identities. For example, there are Arab Jews, there are Sephardic Jews, there are African Jews, there are Asian Jews. But we tend to talk about a monolithic Jewish people and Jewish culture as an ethnic group because we define them in contrast to the dominant religion, which is Christianity in the United States. Another way in which ethnicity differs from race is that ethnicity may be invisible much of the time. Ethnicity may be a subjective feeling. We feel bounded to an ethnic group, but unless we tell someone what our ethnicity is, they may not know. Whereas racialized features are on display all the time. You can look at me and know that I'm a white person, but you can't look at me and know that I'm Scots, Irish, Appalachian, whatever ethnicity you want to categorize me as having. Since ethnic groups are a social construction, we can talk about the extent to which people identify with a given ethnicity. A person may have one ethnicity or they may have multiple. For example, what do you say about a person whose mother is Portuguese and father is Dutch? What ethnicity does that person have? So people may identify with one or more ethnicities to varying extents. And the strength with which they identify with an ethnic identification may vary. That means I may feel very strongly that I'm Appalachian, but have only kind of a tenuous relationship to the idea that I'm Scots-Irish. The salience of someone's identity means the degree to which that identity is front and center in a given situation. So most of the time, it's completely irrelevant to my life that I'm Appalachian. Every now and then, someone will say, "Where is that accent from?" Or "Where did you learn that expression?" Or where do they eat food like that? And then my Appalachian kind of ethnic identification comes into play. I'm made aware that I'm white Appalachian American. The centrality of someone's ethnic identification can also come into play more or less at various times. So, centrality refers to how big a part of someone's identity their ethnic identification is. So, I don't have an ethnic identity that's really central to my understanding of who I am. It's not an important part of how I think of myself. I tend to think of myself as a woman, as a white person, and then based on my relationships or my occupation, right? My ethnic identification is not really central to my sense of who I am. However, for other people, it may be much stronger. People may think of themselves as Asian American first, or may think of themselves as Jewish first. And the strength, salience, and centrality of a person's ethnic identity may vary based on a number of factors. One factor that seems to affect the strength, salience, and centrality of a person's ethnic identity is generational status. Whether they came directly from another country, or whether their parents came from another country, or their parents' parents. Part of the reason I absolutely don't identify with being Scots-Irish is because I'm not entirely sure how many generations ago my family came from Scotland and Ireland. I'm just not. I think it was my great-great-grandparents, but I don't have any real connection to that. Whereas my sister-in-law has a really strong connection to a Korean identity because she herself moved here from Korea when she was 12. So for her, identifying as Korean is a lot more important than identifying as Scots-Irish is for me. Another factor that affects ethnic identification is minority versus majority status. So if a person is a member of an ethnic group that is in the minority in a certain situation, they may feel like their ethnic identity is more salient, more front and center, than if that person is part of the majority group. One reason I don't identify at all with European ethnic identity is because I'm in a cultural situation where most people share my European history, my European background. It just makes no sense to nitpick about where I came from. Whereas if I were the only person from the United States or the only person from the South in a given situation, I might identify with my background a lot more. Another thing that seems to matter is citizenship status. If a person is a citizen of one country or another, they're more likely to identify with that country's dominant ethnicity. Whereas if an immigrant is, for example, a resident of one nation but a citizen of another, they may have a stronger ethnic identity or ethnic identification. Similarly, if a person has multiple national citizenships or dual citizenship, such as dual national citizenship, such as a Jewish person who has Israeli citizenship as well as United States citizenship, they may identify more strongly with that ethnicity. Another factor that seems to matter is whether an ethnic identity is racialized, meaning, do we associate certain ethnicities with certain races? An example would be Caribbean. So if you are a person from the Caribbean, people assume that you are black. People look at you and see a black person, unless you happen to be a person of European descent living in the Caribbean, in which case people completely ignore your Caribbean ethnicity. So when ethnic identities are racialized in different ways, it can affect how a person identifies with that ethnicity. Similarly, the visibility of a person's ethnicity matters in terms of how likely they are to identify with that ethnicity. If a person is obviously Asian and they're Vietnamese, the fact that they're treated differently based on looking Asian may affect how likely they are to identify as Vietnamese. Similarly, if a person appears to be American Indian or Latin American, they may be more likely to identify with that culture and that history. An example is my friend Phil, who was Cuban, but he had red hair, green eyes, and freckles, and so he felt very silly identifying as Latino because he absolutely did not look like what people thought of as a Latino person. So he most of the time just identified as white, non-Latino. So all of these factors and more can relate to how strongly someone identifies with their ethnicity, how salient their ethnicity is, that is, how front and center their ethnicity is in any given situation, and how central or important ethnic identification is to that person's sense of self. Symbolic ethnicity is the idea that a person's ethnic identity may become more salient, that is, more front and center, at some times than at other times. For example, a non-religious person whose family is Jewish may choose to celebrate a bat mitzvah or a coming of age ceremony when they reach adolescence. But they may otherwise not really think about being Jewish except on ceremonial occasions. Another example might be that a person of Caribbean descent may participate in a Caribbean heritage parade, but may otherwise not really think about where they come from in terms of the Caribbean. So it's the idea that at certain times of our lives, or on certain ceremonial occasions, or certain important milestones, our ethnicity becomes important to us, but at other times, we really don't think about it. Situational ethnicity is a slightly different but related concept. I actually don't like the way your textbook explains this because it makes it sound kind of mercenary, like people choose to display their ethnicity whenever it benefits them. In fact, it's really just the idea that a person may choose when to display or engage with their ethnic identity depending on the situation. And there are lots of reasons a person may choose to engage or not to engage with ethnic identity in different situations. A person may choose to engage with their ethnicity or may experience an increase in ethnic identification when, for example, a policy is proposed that would threaten people of their ethnicity. They may not really think of themselves as having a strong ethnic identity most of the time, but if policy changes present a threat, they may pull together with other members of their ethnic group to oppose that policy. Another example might just be choosing when to speak a sending country's language versus choosing when to speak the dominant culture's language. A Mexican American person may choose to speak Spanish at home or in a Mexican grocery store or a church service or another predominantly Mexican space, but speak English most of the rest of the time. In the United States, the idea of ethnicity is strongly tied to the idea of immigration. When we think of ethnic minorities in the United States, we're most often talking about immigrant groups. Even though, of course, European Americans are also immigrants to the United States, and the indigenous peoples are now treated as ethnic minorities, we tend to expect that ethnic minorities will assimilate in some degree to the dominant culture. There are different models of assimilation that we can think about. Assimilation here just means adopting the dominant culture or adapting to the dominant culture. So, the model we think about most commonly is called one way assimilation. In one way assimilation, the ethnic minority assimilates to dominant culture and loses their original sending culture. So, for example, um, my friend Sandra's parents are Mexican, and when they immigrated here, her father chose to only speak English to the children. He literally did not speak to his children unless he knew how to say what he wanted to say in English because he believed they had to speak English. He also gave them dominant culture sounding names. He didn't even give them middle names because he thought that was a specifically Mexican tradition and he didn't want them to sound Mexican. This is an example of one way assimilation. The minority group assimilates to the dominant culture and loses their original sending culture. A different model is called biculturalism, in which the ethnic minority person learns to navigate the dominant culture but still retains elements of their sending culture. An example of this might be a Vietnamese person learning to speak English and follow American traditions and dress in traditional American clothing while still speaking Vietnamese and cooking Vietnamese food at home and practicing Vietnamese religion um, in private. Uh, Pluralism doesn't really exist in any real situations, but we have elements of pluralism in American culture. Pluralism is when multiple cultures coexist in one society, and no culture is dominant or subordinate. So, for example, um, you could imagine if every immigrant group simply fully retained their own culture and there was no dominant culture to assimilate to because all cultures were seen as equally good and equally American. Um, we don't have this, but we see elements of this in American culture. For example, we now think of pizza as an American food, even though it was an immigrant food. Same thing with tacos. We think of tacos as an American food, even though they're definitely Mexican. Um, we have more Chinese restaurants in the United States than we have McDonald's, which I think is a really cool fact. In a lot of ways, Chinese food has become very American. So we have elements of pluralism in that different cultures coexist side by side. But in the United States, we definitely still have a dominant white European American culture that other groups are expected to assimilate to. Whew. Okay, we've done a lot. We've talked about race, racism, and ethnicity today. This is a lot of information, and I would like you to ponder it and to post on the discussion forums any questions you might have, any terms you might not understand, um, any ideas that have come up for you during this lecture and during the reading. Use this time to review, reflect, and think about questions you might have moving forward. Be sure to complete reading the chapter if you haven't already, and let's prepare to pick back up on Wednesday. Okay, it's Wednesday. Let's begin here. Let's review what we've already learned before we commence, and let's read the discussion forums to see if we have answers to some of our questions before we move forward. Let's also think about what other questions we might have about race and ethnicity, especially focusing on race and ethnic inequality. Today we're going to begin by talking about theoretical perspectives on race and ethnicity, and then we're going to talk about racial inequality. First, we're going to talk about some theoretical perspectives on race and ethnicity. It's important to understand that the ones we're going to talk about are not all the theories of race and ethnicity that exist. The more you dig into sociology, the more you'll engage with more complex theories and more refined theories, but we're going to have a broad overview of some major theoretical perspectives as they relate to race and ethnicity. So we're going to begin with structural functionalism. This may seem like a strange place to start, but of course, if you remember, structural functionalism argues that social structures serve functions, and that when social structures become dysfunctional, they either evolve or dissolve. So, for structural functionalists, the fact that we have racial and ethnic categories in the United States and in contemporary life um, illustrates that those categories serve some purpose. So, for structural functionalism, prejudice and discrimination may result from in group cohesion. Essentially, they're not the structure that functions, they're a result of a different structure functioning. So, in group cohesion is simply feeling that you belong and feeling that you're part of a group, and then defining other groups as outsiders and treating them differently than you treat your in group. So, for structural functionalists, prejudice and discrimination may just be a side effect of strongly identifying with your own group. For structural functionalists, assimilation is a big and important concept. Minority groups are expected to assimilate to the dominant culture of a society. Not to do so threatens cohesion and stability. And assimilation is seen as the one way assimilation is seen as the model of immigrant groups adapting to a dominant culture. For structural functionalists, you can also imagine that experiences of discrimination can shape identity among minority groups. So, for example, there was a period in American history following Reconstruction and before the Civil Rights Movement in the early 1900s to 1920s, in which a black middle class flourished in certain parts of the country, especially in Oklahoma. There was in the city of Tulsa, there was a neighborhood known as Black Wall Street, which was a booming, thriving, upper class black neighborhood. Basically, because black Americans had been excluded from majority institutions and majority opportunities, they had created their own economy in parallel to the dominant white economy and had shaped their own kind of parallel society, parallel class structure alongside dominant white culture. Black Wall Street was razed, that is R-A-Z-E-D, razed, as in torn to the ground, by white mobs who didn't like black people getting ahead that much. But the structural functionalist argument here is that if a group experiences discrimination by the dominant culture, it may shape their identity as a group. I've specified here that we're talking about Marxist conflict theories because, in fact, there are many theories of race in sociology that would qualify as conflict theories. But here we're talking about classical Marxist conflict theory. And for Marx, race is just a way for the powerful to divide the powerless. It's a way for the bourgeoisie to divide the proletariat against itself. By creating artificial divisions, the bourgeoisie creates a sense of false consciousness among the proletariat. For Marx, false consciousness is anything we identify with other than class consciousness. So, anything that distracts us from recognizing our shared plight as oppressed workers is just a distraction. It's a source of false identification that distracts us from class struggle. And so for Marx, the solution to racism is class consciousness. Once working white people recognize that they have more in common with working people of color than they have in common with the dominant class, with the bourgeoisie, then we as workers will realize that racism is false and is a distraction, and we will reject it. But the solution to racism is class consciousness. From a symbolic interactionist perspective, race and ethnicity are what are called ascribed statuses. An ascribed status is a social status that is attributed to you. That is, it's a status you don't do anything to achieve. It's just something that people think about you. So, for example, for me, white is an ascribed status. I didn't sign up to be white. I didn't go through a white coming of age ritual to become white. People look at me and decide that I am white. It's an ascribed status. Ascribed means given to you or attributed to you. And we interact around those statuses. We interact around them because race and ethnicity have symbolic meanings. When we think of a person being white or black, or Asian, or Latino, or American Indian, we have ideas about what that means. Entire profiles come into our mind about what that person's life might be like, what it means to have that identity, how we interact based on that identity. And then we follow social scripts around our race and ethnic identities. If you don't believe me, think about the narrative of not acting black, like black people not acting black. When black people don't act in ways that are stereotypically black, they may be accused of not acting black enough, or of trying to act white. That's because we have social scripts around race and ethnic identity that dictate how we're supposed to behave in certain situations. I'm posting on Moodle a link to a Donald Glover clip. It's a stand-up comedy clip in which Donald Glover talks about being expected to act certain ways because of his race. Critical race theory is a more contemporary theory related to race and ethnicity, but I think it's very important to talk about it, even though it's not necessarily discussed in your textbook. Critical race theory examines ways in which racism is built into our social and legal systems. It seeks to apply social science knowledge to proactively create greater racial equality. So it started with founders like W.E.B. Du Bois and Frantz Fanon, who were writing in the early 1900s. And it applies social science knowledge to the agenda of creating racial equality. It takes as a premise that racial inequality is a problem that social scientists should seek to address. It also posits that in order to understand race and racism, we have to center the knowledge and experiences of people of color. What do I mean by that? As we talked about when we talked about how racial categories are created, they're created by the dominant group. And the meanings attached to those categories are also dictated by the dominant group. So, for critical race theorists, what's important is to learn to think about race and ethnic categories from the perspectives of the targeted group. So, what does it mean to be black for black people? Not what characteristics do white people attribute to black people, but what does blackness look like from a black perspective? what is the American Indian experience from the perspective of American Indians? What's important about Indianness to American Indians? Um, and in order to really understand the problems of racism, we have to bring that knowledge, that perspective to the forefront and think about how racism looks from the perspective of the targeted group, not the dominant group. Critical race theory also emphasizes that we should be critical of dominant white discourses of racial history. Um, that is, uh, even when people of color take actions to advance their own equality, white people often craft the narrative and the discourse around that struggle. Here's an example. You've all heard of Martin Luther King Jr., and in fact, we all celebrate Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday in February, or in January, and that's great. But for critical race theorists, Martin Luther King Jr. was a liberal black person who was aligned with dominant white interests. So the way he sought to bring about integration and civil rights was kind of a kinder, gentler model with passive resistance, nonviolent action, lobbying efforts, peaceful protests. There were other activists attached to the civil rights movement at the same time, working in parallel to Martin Luther King Jr., who we never hear about. An example is Robert F. Williams, who, in contrast to Martin Luther King's passive, promoted a movement called Armed Self-Reliance. Robert F. Williams was a World War II veteran who had fought on the Western Front in World War II, and then came home as a veteran to face disrespect and racist threats in his own country. Robert F. Williams felt that the solution was to meet violence with violence, to arm black men and women, and to rise up violently and demand equal rights. Robert F. Williams was an important leader in the black civil rights movement in certain circles, but he's largely lost to history because he doesn't fit with a dominant white discourse. He doesn't fit with the kind of civil rights movement that white people liked and wanted to talk about. For a critical race theorist, Robert F. Williams was scary to white people, and therefore doesn't get taught in schools or celebrated or recognized for his contributions to civil rights. Intersectionality is the final theory I want us to talk about in relationship to race. Intersectionality is another contemporary theory. The term intersectionality was actually coined in 1989 by a labor attorney named Kimberly Crenshaw. Kimberly Crenshaw was representing a worker who was not being promoted at Ford Motor Company. The woman was black, and she argued that because she was a black woman, she was not being promoted appropriately and was being passed over for promotion in favor of less qualified white people and less qualified men. Ford Motor Company argued that this woman was not being discriminated against based on race because they promoted black people, and that she was not being discriminated against based on gender because they promoted women. However, all the women that Ford Motor Company promoted were white, and all the black people that Ford Motor Company promoted were men. They never promoted people who were both women and black. Kimberly Crenshaw famously made the analogy that it's as if this woman had been hit by a car in the middle of an intersection. but because she wasn't hit on one street or the other, the driver was not culpable. She argued that we all are at an intersection of multiple identities, including race, including gender, including sexuality, including age, including occupation, etc., and that we don't live on one of those identities or the other. We live at an intersection, at a confluence of all of those identities all the time. We're always both our racial identity and every other identity that we have. And each of those statuses shapes our experience of all our other statuses. So, for example, a person who's a gay black man will experience being black differently from a straight black man. He'll also experience being gay differently from a white gay man. He'll also experience being white differently from a woman. He'll also experience being gay differently from a black lesbian. All of his identities will shape his experience of all his other identities. And it makes no sense to ask somebody to disentangle those identities and focus on just one at a time, because we are all of our identities all of the time. Now that we've talked about the history of race and ethnicity in the United States and some theoretical understandings of race and ethnicity, I want us to talk about some examples of racial inequality. I want to be clear, I'm focusing on economic inequality in this lecture, but there are many kinds of racial and ethnic inequality that we could focus on, including interpersonal discrimination, inequalities in health outcomes, inequalities in level of stress. There are multiple forms of inequality that affect people of color in the United States, but I'm only going to focus on one as an example. Also, I want to point out that many of the data we have on race and ethnic inequality in the United States focuses heavily on black-white differences. This can feel frustrating, especially for people who are not black or white, who want to understand inequality better and don't feel represented in the data. The reason for this is that black-white differences tend to be the most extreme, with members of other race and ethnic groups falling somewhere in the middle. So black-white differences you can think of as kind of the canary in the coal mine. If black-white differences exist, we understand that other race ethnic groups are also experiencing inequality. And that's found pretty consistently across studies of different kinds. So try to bear with me with the limited data that we're working with and the example of economic inequality. So looking at this chart, we see the black-white wealth gap in the United States in 2016. To orient you to the chart, the y-axis on the left-hand side of the chart shows net worth. So this is all the assets someone owns minus their debts. And it ranges from $0 to $200,000. The x-axis along the bottom of the chart goes from the year 1989 to the year 2016. The blue line at the top of the chart represents the median wealth of white families in the United States. Median wealth means the middle wealth. So it's not the average wealth. It's the wealth of the person who's in the middle of all wealth. So if we took all white Americans and lined them up from poorest to richest, the person in the very middle would be the median. So we have the median wealth of all white families represented in blue. The orange line at the bottom is the same measure for black families. Those are the two lines I really want you to attend to right now. The median wealth for white families is $163,000. That means the white family in the very middle of the distribution owns about $163,000 worth of assets. For black families, that is $16,000. So this is about a factor of 10 difference. The typical white family owns about 10 times as much wealth as the typical black family. That line in the middle, the purple line, illustrates another fact, that if you took all black families in America and lined them up from poorest to richest, and you took the person who was 3/4 of the way up the distribution, meaning the 75% of black Americans earned less than them, and 25% earned more than them, putting them at the 75th percentile. That very rich black family would still not really approach the white median. So even if you look at the richest 25% of black Americans, they still owned about $100,000 in wealth in 2016, which is about $63,000 less wealth than white Americans at the median. So the richest quarter of black Americans own less wealth than the middle of the white distribution. So if you look at this chart, it shows how income, not wealth, differs among black and white Americans in the United States in 2014. So the y-axis in this case is along the right side of the chart, and it goes from $0 to $120,000 a year in income. The x-axis along the bottom of the chart goes from 1940 to 2014. The orange line at the bottom of the chart shows black median male workers' incomes in 2014. So if you were to line up all black male workers in the United States in 2014, the person in the middle would be earning about $20,000. If you did the same thing for white male workers in 2014, you would find that the one in the middle earned about $40,000. Now, if you went to the person who cut off the top 10% of the distribution, for black men, that would be about $70,000. And for white men, it would be about $120,000. So what this shows us is that just like with wealth, even the top 10% of workers are divided by race. So being in the top 10% of earners doesn't erase the wealth gap. In fact, it's almost exactly the same. It's about twice as high at the median and about twice as high at the 90th percentile for whites as for blacks. Now, before we go too far into this chart, I do want to point out that people of all races and ethnicities with college educations earn a lot more than people with no college education. So the takeaway from this chart is that college does not erase wealth gaps. The takeaway is not that college is useless. But if you look at median net worth in thousands of 2016 dollars for people of different racial and ethnic groups with a bachelor degree and no bachelor degree, you can notice a couple of things. First of all, white people who have no bachelor's degree have a median net worth of $100,000. White people with a bachelor's degree or higher have a median net worth of about $400,000. For black people, having no bachelor's degree results in a net worth of between $0 and $50,000. It looks like right around $20,000. For those with a bachelor's degree, it goes up to about $60,000 or $70,000. So having a bachelor's degree or higher greatly increases your net worth, even if you are a member of a race ethnic minority group. But Black people with a bachelor degree still have a lower net worth than white people with no bachelor's degree. The same is true for Hispanics. Median net worth is statistically the same. And people with other ethnicity, other race or ethnicity, which would include Asian Americans, American Indians, and people who identify as another race or ethnicity, including mixed race, are somewhere in the middle. They're higher than Black people and Hispanic people, but lower than white people. So we see that just because you go to college doesn't mean things will be equalized. In fact, race gaps persist among college graduates. Another reality is that even though college education improves economic outcomes for people of all race and ethnicities, college is not equally accessible, and college attempts are not equally successful for people of all races and ethnicities. I'd like you in the discussion forums to talk about some reasons this might be. This chart shows students admitted to college. So bear in mind, these are students who wanted to go to college and got into college. And what it shows is what outcome people have had after 6 years of enrolling in college. So most people graduate in 4 years. Some people take a little longer. But 6 years out, how are people doing after enrolling in college? For white people, we're going to look at white people as a reference category. For white people, 47.5% of people who enrolled in college have graduated at the same institution they started at within 6 years. 14.5% transferred and graduated. 11.2% are still trying. They're still enrolled in college somewhere. And 26.9% are no longer enrolled in college. So they didn't complete, and they're not transferred and trying somewhere else. They just kind of quit. If we look at Black Americans, the percentages are almost flipped. 28.7% of Black Americans who enroll in college complete within 6 years at the institution where they started. An additional 9.3% graduate from somewhere else. So we can say that about 40% have graduated from somewhere, compared with about 60% for white Americans. 17.4% are still enrolled, meaning it's taken them at least 6 years to complete a college education. And 44.6% are no longer enrolled anywhere. They have effectively dropped out of college. Now, this is within 6 years of enrolling for the first time. So this doesn't mean that those students aren't going to go forward and complete college later. But it does mean that they're having worse 6-year outcomes than white Americans. Hispanic Americans are in the middle, with 35.6% completing at the institution where they started, and an additional 10.2% completing somewhere else within 6 years, and 35% no longer enrolled within 6 years. Asian Americans tend to have the best educational outcomes, with 51% completing at the starting institution, and about 63% completing somewhere within 6 years, and 20% no longer enrolled within 6 years. So we see that even among students who get into college and want to attend college and want to complete college, college completion is most successful for white and Asian students compared with Black and Hispanic students. And I'd like us to, in the discussion forums, talk about some reasons that might be and relate it perhaps to our experiences at BSC. Please discuss one or two of these discussion questions in the discussion forum. There are too many complex questions to discuss all of them, but please pick one and either ask a question or respond to someone else's question.